Chapter 1. The Northerner. Mount Takayubi, Kusanagi Peninsula, Shirajima Province, the Kaigenese Empire, Planet Duna, 5369 Y.S.P. It was a harrowing climb to the high school. 821 steps. Mamoru had counted one time on his way up, no easy feat, while focusing on not toppling off the side of a mountain. For most 14-year-old fighters, the winding way up to the school was a true test of nerve and agility, but Mamoru, with his springy legs and boundless energy, woke each morning looking forward to the challenge. Mamoru, his friends panted from the steps far below him. Not so fast. Itsuki and Yuta had no choice but to take the steep path to the school because they lived in the western village, further down the mountain. Mamoru's family compound was built high enough that he could have taken an easier way if he chose, but Matsudas weren't known for taking the easy way to anything. He rose every day before dawn, amid the chanting of crickets, so he could make the loop down the mountain toward the western village and tackle the steep climb with his friends. "You two are too slow," Mamoru called back. "We don't want to be late." "We're not going to be late," Itsuki heaved in exasperation from the mist below. "Just wait up. Please." Fine. Mamoru lowered himself to the rock ledge and sat, letting his feet hang over the edge. It had still been dark when the three boys began their climb, but by now morning had seeped through the veil of fog to touch the rock face with its pale brushstrokes. It was rarely possible to see the base of the mountain from the kimono steps. Beneath Mamoru's dangling legs, there was only mist, rolling in slow waves against the cliffside, growing gradually lighter with the sunrise. The moment Itsuki and Yuta dragged themselves over the ridge where Mamoru was perched, he grinned and bounced to his feet. "Finally," he said. "Are you two ready to keep up now? Are you kidding?" Yuta gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. "You're a monster." Itsuki groaned. Mamoru slapped each of them on the back. "I'll wait for you at the school," he said cheerfully and took off up the mountain. His toes knew each crevice, each jutting rock, and he took the steepest part of the path in swift, confident bounds, skipping 6 steps at a time. He had just rounded the last curve when his feet slowed. There was a figure hunched over in the fog up ahead, a boy clinging hard to the rock wall as he gasped for breath. Mamoru wouldn't have thought much of it. There were dozens of students who climbed these steps each morning, but this boy's clothing wasn't right. Instead of kimono blue, he wore a modern-looking black uniform Mamoru had never seen before. "Good morning," Mamoru said, approaching slowly, so as not to startle the newcomer off the edge. "Morning." The boy raised a hand in greeting before putting it to his chest, still breathing hard. He had a heavy accent. "Are you?" Mamoru started and then switched to Kaijengwa, the imperial standard. "Are you a transfer student?" The boy nodded. "I'm Kwang Chulhi. Nice to meet you." A northern name. This boy hadn't just transferred from a neighboring province. He had come from a long way away. His uniform was the kind worn in the big cities on the Yangtze Peninsula, with its Yamenka-style cut and military bogolan patterns. "Matsuda Mamoru," Mamoru introduced himself, bowing. "Matsuda Mamoru," the boy repeated. "How much farther is it to your damn school?" "You're almost there," Mamoru laughed. "I can walk with you the rest of the way. I'm not afraid I'll get lost." Kwang looked vaguely exasperated. "I'm afraid I'll fall off the edge. No one's ever died falling from the steps." Below the mist, there was a spring-fed lake that never froze, waiting to catch clumsy students who lost their footing. "That's what I heard," Kwang said, "but I bet it still hurts." It does. One time, in his first year, Mamoru had jumped from the steps to see what it felt like to fly. He had regretted the decision deeply when he hit the surface tension of the lake, but he would never forget the feeling of the wind roaring around him, so ferocious it started to feel like ocean. "But don't worry," Mamoru reassured the boy. "I've climbed these steps 100 times. I know where the rough places are, so if you miss a step, I'll catch you." "You're that fast." Kwang didn't look convinced. Mamoru didn't mind. Let him think what he wanted. "Speed is valued in this village," Mamoru said by way of explanation. "We're all swordsmen here." "I see that." Kwang nodded at the wooden practice sword sticking out of Mamoru's school bag. "We can fight empty-handed too," Mamoru assured him, "but traditional swordplay is the preferred fighting style." You any good at it? I'm a Matsuda. I don't know what that means. It means yes, Mamoru said. And what fighting style is popular in your region? He asked, curious about what kind of warrior this boy was. What fighting style? Kwang raised his eyebrows. Video games. Mamoru laughed. We don't play many of those here. Why not? You do have infocom devices, don't you? Mamoru shook his head. What? Kwang looked stunned. Well, the mayor has one, I think. We're a fairly traditional village. Yeah, I noticed. Itsuki and Yuta caught up to the pair on the last stretch of stairs, and the Western Village boys introduced themselves. I'm Mizumaki Itsuki, Itsuki said, unthinkingly using the Shirajima dialect. The boys all spoke with each other. This is Yukino Yuta. Oh. I am Kwang Chulhee, Kwang said in a valiant attempt at a Shirajima dialect greeting. Yorashika Onegaishimasu. You mean Onigi, Mamoru corrected him. Onegaishimasu. And you don't really pronounce the su part unless you're a little kid. Oh. Don't worry, Mamoru said. A lot of the classes are taught in Kaigenwa. That was standard across the empire. By the time they reached the school, the city boy was out of breath again. The stately pillars were the first part of the building that came into view through the mist, their black finish slick with condensation, followed by the curving clay-tiled roof. Kimono Academy was built into the rock face, its inner structures carved right out of the mountain. The intricate wood and lacquer front of the building was supported by a network of pillars and beams that creaked in high winds, but had held the structure in place for 100 years. Kwang paused at the front steps, clinging to a carved wooden railing for support, looking like he might empty his stomach into the mists below. Why would you build a school in a place like this? He said in horror. Kimono wasn't actually built to be a school, Yuta said. It used to be a monastery. Oh. That explains the decor, Kwang said, eyeing the fearsome statues of Ryuhan Falea saints standing guard at the doors. The place was left vacant after the Fina monks built the new temple, further down the mountain in the western village, Yuta said. And they decided it was a good place for a school? Kwang said, incredulous. Well, Kimono is Takayubi's elite Koro school, Mamoru explained as the boys mounted the front steps into the Genkan. The village officials thought it would be appropriate if you had to be an elite Koro to reach it. The smell of incense had never quite left the wooden halls of Kimono. The familiar scent enveloped the four boys as they joined the sleepy gaggle of students at the shoe shelves and knelt to undo the fastenings on their tabi. As Kwang, still shaking, fumbled with his shoes, Mamoru's gaze was drawn to the northern boys' feet. Instead of the two-toed tabi the Takayubi boys wore, Kwang was sporting bulky, shiny Yamenka-style shoes that fastened with magnets around the ankles. Mamoru had seen shoes like that on TV, but no one in Shirajima had ever owned a pair. I don't know how I'm supposed to make that climb every morning, Kwang said, cramming his oversized shoes into an open slot. If you want an easier walk, you could always transfer to Takayubi Public High School, Itsuki suggested. Oh no, Kwang laughed. My father won't have me in any school, but the best in the region whenever we move to a new place. You move often? Yuta asked. Kwang nodded. My father's a traveling representative for a communications company, so we move all over the country, sometimes outside it. Outside it? Itsuki said in astonishment. Where have you been? Kwang took a moment to think. I've been to Yama a few times, Kodazui a few times, Sizui once. For a few weeks, boys, a voice said. If your shoes are put away, you should be in your classrooms. Yukino-sensei. Itsuki exclaimed as he and the other boys bowed. We're sorry. Yukino Dai was the best swordsman in the province, or the second best, depending on who you asked. There was debate about whether he could beat Mamoru's father, Matsuda Takaru, or his uncle, Matsuda Takashi, in a duel. The Yukino clan had none of the Matsuda's secret bloodline techniques, but Yukino Dai was about as good as a man could get with a naked blade. We have a new student with us, Sensei, Mamoru explained. He isn't sure where he's supposed to go. I see. Yukino-sensei looked past Mamoru at the new boy, who stuck out starkly in his Bogolan uniform. You must be Kwang Chulhee. Yes, sir. Kwang bowed and said very carefully, Yorashika Onegaishimasu. The swordmaster visibly suppressed a smile at Kwang's pronunciation. Welcome to Kimono Academy, he said in Kaigenwa. How was your first time up the steps? Super easy, sir, Kwang said, despite the obvious flush in his cheeks. I can't wait to do it again. Yukino-sensei's face broke into an open smile. I like you, Kwang, he said. You can follow me to the office to pick up your schedule. Matsuda. He turned to Mamoru. Run to the storeroom and find a uniform for Kwang. Your size should do. Yes, sir. Mamoru bowed and hurried to do as he was told. He moved quickly through the narrow halls to the supply closet, his legs absorbing the shifting of the floor as the school swayed on its posts. Morning, Mamoru-kun. Other boys greeted him. Good morning, Matsuda-senpai. He made sure he gave each of them a bow and a smile as he went. There was no lock on the storeroom door. Kimono was a small enough high school, Takayubi was a small enough town, that no one worried much about theft. Where would a thief even keep a stolen item? Where would he try to sell it? Everyone here knew everyone. Mamoru had to clamber over a box of broken practice swords and a stack of dummies to reach the shelf of spare uniforms. Keeping his footing became a challenge as the school creaked and the dummies shifted beneath him, but what kind of Matsuda would he be if a little breeze threw him off balance? With the next gust of wind, the stack of dummies tipped toward the shelves. Mamoru leaned forward, snatched a size 4 uniform from its shelf, and sprang from the top of the stack to the floor before anything fell. After double-checking the uniform size, he hurried to the office to meet Yukino-sensei and Kwang. Thank you, Matsuda, Yukino-sensei said as Mamoru handed the new boy his uniform. Now, Kwang is going to be entering our second-year class, which means his schedule is identical to yours. Mamoru nodded. Being the more exclusive of 2 high schools in a small town, Kimono Academy had only 1 class per grade level. I'm putting him in your charge. You'll look after him for today. Yes, sensei. Start by showing him where the changing rooms are. And be quick. You boys only have a few Sierrana before classes start. Kwang took longer than Mamoru would have thought to change into his new uniform, and Mamoru found himself pacing impatiently on the creaking floor before the changing room door. When Kwang finally emerged, he was still fiddling with the waist tie as if he had all the time in the world. This is so funny, he said, shaking out the uniform's broad blue sleeves. I feel like I'm in one of those old samurai movies. Well, for us, this is just a normal school uniform, Mamoru said, frowning. This place is weird. Kwang ran his hands over his sleeves, looking at the ornately carved temple halls around him. It's like I stepped through a portal back in time. Mamoru felt annoyance bristle up inside him. He wasn't sure why. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could come up with the right words, the old temple bell sounded. The single ancient note reverberated through the hall, as it had done for 100 years, calling the boys of Takayubi to class. Misaki. Healthy, just like his brothers? Hayari asked, leaning in to put a hand on the infant's head. Yes, Misaki said, if a little smaller. I can't believe this one is your 4th. Yes, Misaki sighed, trying to make her tone light, despite the heaviness in her limbs, hopefully the last. No, Hayari exclaimed, scandalized. How can you say that? Yeah, you're doing so well, why stop now? Setsuko joked, shifting her own baby to her other hip to nudge her sister-in-law. Seriously, Misaki? Hayari said with an ache in her voice. You're so lucky. Misaki nodded, forcing a smile. I suppose I am. And Misaki was lucky. By Shirajima standards, she was the luckiest woman in the world. Fresh out of Theonite Academy, she had been fortunate enough to marry into Shirajima's greatest warrior family. And following that, she had been blessed with son after son after son. There had been a rough space of years after Mamoru, when she hadn't been able to give birth, but 5 years ago, she had born Hiroshi, then soon after him, Nagisa, and now Izumo. For healthy boys, every Shirajima woman's dream. May I? Hayari asked, an eager sparkle in her eyes. Of course. Careful to support the infant's unsteady head, Misaki handed Izumo to her friend. You're looking much better, Setsuko commented as Hayari gushed and cooed over an oblivious Izumo. I feel much better, Misaki said, rolling her shoulders, at least now that you're here. I missed you too. Normally, the three housewives spent the majority of their waking hours together, letting their little ones play together, passing around the babies as they did their shopping, laundry, cooking, and sewing. Since giving birth to Izumo, Misaki had been too exhausted to do much except look after the infant, and Takuro had insisted that she wasn't well enough for company. This was the first time Izumo was meeting Hairi and his aunt Setsuko. He could be a fussy baby, but he didn't seem bothered by the new faces, if he could even make out facial features. He was still so young that his eyes hadn't found their focus yet. For sons, Setsuko mused, burping her own daughter, Ayumi, on her shoulder. I don't know how I'm ever supposed to catch up to that. Although, look at these chunky little arms. Ayumi could almost pass for a boy. Perhaps I'll start dressing her in boy clothes and just pretend I've given my husband a healthy son. Baby Ayumi, only 2 months Izumo Sr., was nearly twice his size. What do you think? I think she's perfect the way she is. Misaki was being honest, but of course, the other two women laughed. When she was younger, Misaki had always pictured herself having daughters. She had enjoyed the vague fantasy of raising powerful, forward-thinking young women with the courage to amount to more than their mother, but it was just that, a fantasy. Misaki had long since let go of the idea that she could raise her children the way she wanted, or that they were even her children at all. Her sons were Matsuda's first and foremost. Their sole purpose was to grow to be powerful warriors, like their father before them and his father before him. They belonged to the Matsuda house, as she did. I'm being serious, Misaki insisted as Hairi passed baby Izumo back to her. I would be happy to have a daughter. With a daughter, at least, she might be allowed to pass some of herself on to her own child. Easy for you to say when you're on your 4th son, Hairi said indignantly. Setsuko hummed in agreement. You're going to have to tell us how you pulled it off. I want to know how she pulled it off and kept her figure, Hairi said. Oh, shut up you. Setsuko swatted Hairi on the back of the head. The prettiest little slip of a woman in the village doesn't get to say things like that. Setsuko, Hairi said, blushing furiously. I'm not the prettiest. Shut your pretty mouth, Hairi, Misaki said fondly. You don't need to play dumb with us. We like you better when you're smart. Hairi was rarely smart, but Misaki thought she might as well keep encouraging her. Popular wisdom said that a woman as pretty as Hairi didn't need to be smart. Pretty wasn't even the right word to describe Hairi, in Misaki's opinion. The woman was achingly, devastatingly beautiful, with an artless smile and eyes as soft as melting snow. Many Shirajima women were pretty, but Hairi was the kind of legendary beauty men went to war for. Couple of purebred princesses, both of you, Setsuko said, looking from Hairi to Misaki in exasperation. With your smooth skin and your teensy little waists. Don't you sit there and complain about your weight to me when I could fit the two of you inside me. Ironically, it was Setsuko who Misaki considered to be the most beautiful woman on the mountain. When Fisherman's daughter had married into the Matsuda family, she had brought with her all the crude, shameless joy Misaki missed so much from her life before Takayubi. Her sword of beauty had little to do with physical attributes. It wasn't the short hair cropped about her ears, it was the way she shook it out and sighed in pleasure when she was enjoying the weather. It wasn't her big eyes with their dark lashes, it was the way they crinkled up with mirth at the smallest things. It wasn't her bulky frame, it was the way she threw it around with careless confidence in a world where everyone, ladies and swordsmen alike, stepped so lightly. Before they were sisters-in-law, Misaki had known Setsuko, as everyone had known her, as the fresh fish lady. Her voice could be heard on any trip to the markets at the base of the mountain. Fresh fish. Get your fresh fish. It wasn't a glamorous job, but Setsuko was the kind of person who could be at her most charming elbows deep in fish guts, with loose strands of hair sticking to the sweat on her temples. Misaki had to imagine that many people had fallen in love with the stocky fisherwoman with the carefree grin, but it was Matsuda Takashi, the first son of the highest house in the region, who fell the hardest. Misaki had first suspected the morning her brother-in-law stopped her on her way out the door and said, "You look tired, Misaki. I can go to the market for you." For a moment, Misaki had only managed to blink up at him. "You want to go to the market?" she said blankly. Shopping for meals wasn't something a man was supposed to do, certainly not a nobleman like Takashi. I have business to attend to at the base of the mountain anyway. Takashi didn't meet her eyes. I'm feeling fine, Nisama, Misaki assured him. If you have important business, you shouldn't trouble yourself. It's no trouble, Takashi said, and Misaki realized that he was speaking in a low voice, as if worried that his father and brother would hear from inside the house. Just give me a list of what you need. All right. Confused as she was, Misaki wasn't going to argue. And Misaki? Yes, Nisama? If you could maybe not mention this to my father? Misaki's suspicions were confirmed when Takashi returned late that afternoon and deposited 8 bulging baskets of fish in her kitchen. No man but a Matsuda could have carried such a load all the way up the mountain. As strong as Takashi was, the effort had lent his face a bright flush. Fish, he said with a drunken smile that'll became the son of a warrior family. You said you wanted fresh fish, right? I'm sorry. I might have missed the other things on your list. Misaki looked in horror at the heaping baskets on her kitchen floor. I'm sorry, Nisama. What do you want me to do with all this? The Matsuda compound didn't have freezer space to store this many fish. Are you expecting company? What? No. Why? Is this too much? Misaki looked up at her brother-in-law, incredulous and more than a little annoyed. If you like the girl, just tell her straight, she wanted to snap. Don't blow the family fortune on fish. But it wasn't her place to question him, and it wasn't that simple. A nobleman couldn't just propose to a fisherman's daughter and whisk her away up the mountain. Not in Takayubi. Peasants with no bloodlines to protect might marry whoever they liked, but men and women of noble houses didn't have that luxury. Is it too much? Takashi asked again, still dazed and so much giddier than usual, like a love-struck teenager, like Misaki had been once. The thought pierced her chest with a sudden and unexpected pain. Be careful, big brother, she wanted to say then. Be careful how hard you love what you know you can't have, but that also was not her place. So instead, she pursed her lips, looked down at the fish and said, I'll think of something. Good, Takashi said, though he didn't really seem to see or hear her. Good, and he wandered out of the kitchen, still smiling. On his way out, he passed Takaru, who regarded his older brother with the same sour expression he took on whenever he saw someone happy. Is my brother ill? He asked when Takashi had gone. No, Misaki thought sadly, just doomed to misery. But Takashi had been lucky, or rather, just the right combination of lucky, reckless, and clever. He had struggled and schemed and spun excuses and somehow managed to hold off marriage until his tyrannical father had passed away and there were no Matsuda elders left to tell him what to do. Then, instead of marrying a pure-blooded noblewoman his family's choosing, Takashi married the woman he loved, the peasant with the loud laugh who sold him his fresh fish. Takashi would never know, but in marrying Setsuko, he might have saved Misaki's life. The fisherwoman had moved into the Matsuda compound shortly after Misaki's second miscarriage, a loud burst of color when everything seemed gray. You haven't smiled the whole time I've been here, Setsuko had observed as Misaki helped her unpack the few belongings she had brought with her. Why so glum, little sister? Misaki was 2 years older than her new sister-in-law, but Setsuko had married the older of the 2 Matsuda brothers, and in this world, the man's status was the only thing that mattered. I'm sorry, Misaki murmured. It had become her default response to anything over the past few years. Setsuko planted her hands on her hips. That's not good enough. Excuse me. Look, you and I are going to be here in this house together until we're both wrinkly old hags with all our teeth falling out. I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend the next 40 years with a woman who doesn't know how to smile. I know how to smile. There had been a time Misaki had been accused of smiling too much, but over the years, Takayubi had worn away at her, turning her into this quivering, brittle thing, afraid the sound of her own voice might shake her to pieces if she spoke too loud. I've never seen you smile, Setsuko said skeptically. What's wrong with you? Are the corners of your mouth busted or something? No. It was the inside of Misaki that was broken. I miscarried, she said bluntly twice. Oh. Setsuko pulled up short, her joking demeanor evaporating in an instant. Oh, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Misaki thought she might crumble under the concern in Setsuko's eyes. The years had hardened her against her father-in-law's cruelty and her husband's indifference, but she had no armor against that honest gaze. You really wanted those children? Setsuko asked, and the softness of her voice stripped Misaki bare. I don't know, she replied, stunned and slightly horrified at her own honesty. She waited, shoulders tense, for Setsuko to berate her for her selfishness, to blame her for losing the children, to tell her she was lucky to have such a tolerant husband, like everyone else did. Setsuko only said, "Oh. Then why are you so sad?" When, Misaki wondered, had her voice gotten so small? When had she become afraid to put a single thought into words? I'm here to give my husband sons. I don't want to be a disappointment. You're not a disappointment. What? I said, you're not a disappointment. You couldn't be if you tried. It had been a long time since someone had spoken of Misaki with that sort of simple confidence, taking for granted that she was right and good. She stared at Setsuko for a moment and realized that she had forgotten how to respond to this type of kindness. It was something she thought she had left behind 9 years ago. Look at you, Setsuko continued earnestly. What could a man possibly complain about? You're sweet, you're beautiful, I get the feeling you're pretty smart too, you've already born a perfect son, and my husband tells me your cooking is to die for. That's nice of him to say. I do my best. You like cooking? Misaki nodded. Well, that's good because I'm a lousy cook. I'm sure that's not true, Misaki said politely. Oh, it is. Ask anyone who's ever eaten one of my meals. Now, why don't you make yourself useful and teach me to cook something for my fancy husband and his refined Matsuda palate? Matsuda palates aren't that refined, Misaki said. Your husband likes the same food as everyone else. Not when I make it, he won't. Why do you think I was always the one hauling the fish to market instead of staying home to help in the kitchen? My family tried my cooking exactly once and then decided they'd rather live. Misaki felt her face split into a smile, and for the first time in an age, she giggled. There's that smile. Setsuko exclaimed, triumphant. And look at that. She poked a finger into Misaki's cheek. What? Misaki put her hand to her face, thinking maybe there was a piece of rice stuck to it. You've got dimples. Misaki had never had any sisters, but from that day, she decided that she was glad to call Setsuko her sister. Their husbands carried with them all the tension that accompanied growing up as brothers, a first and second son competing for their father's approval, but the sisters-in-law never let any of that bad niyama in between them. After Misaki had lived in the Matsuda compound almost a decade, it was Setsuko who made its cold halls feel like a home. When Misaki was in pain, it was Setsuko who went to the western village to buy her remedies. When she got lost in the undertow of her thoughts, it was Setsuko who pulled her back with a joke. A few months after Hiroshi was born, it was Setsuko who said, that pretty little thing who lives in the Yukino compound. Who's she? You mean Hairi? Misaki said. She's Yukino Dai's wife. Yukino who? Yukino Dai, Misaki said, the house patriarch, the lightning swordsman. I thought the Yukino patriarch was Yukino Ryosuke. It was. He passed away a little while before you moved here, while you were getting ready for your wedding. Didn't you know? No, Setsuko exclaimed. Nami, I haven't been in on the market gossip. That's where I used to get all my news. God's in the deep, I don't know how you noble women live cooped up like this. You're a noble woman too now, Misaki reminded her. Setsuko made a dismissive ba, waving her hand. Yukino Ryosuke's funeral was just before you got married. Someone had to assume control of the estate, and the Yukino's oldest son didn't want to move his family all the way back from Yongsan. Dai-san is the second son, so he moved in with his wife. Does he keep his wife cloistered or some kind of weird noble thing like that? Setsuko asked. How come we never see her? I think she spends most of her time caring for Dai-san's mother. She's old and very ill, so I imagine it takes up most of her time. That must get lonely, Setsuko said. We should go visit tomorrow. That was how the sisters-in-law had met Hairi. Now, 5 years later, the three women were inseparable. Hayuri and Setsuko were still teasing one another about their waistlines when there was a tug at Misaki's arm. She looked down to find her third son, 2-year-old Nagisa, clutching the flowered sleeve of her kimono. "See?" he asked in his tiny voice. "See, baby?" It was his favorite question since Izumo had arrived. "Of course," Misaki said, kneeling on the tatame to place Izumo on her lap before Nagisa. "Remember to be gentle, Nagakuen. He's still very small." "Hold baby?" Nagisa asked hopefully, holding out his arms. "Oh, isn't he the cutest thing?" Hayuri squealed. "I'm going to hold him for now," Misaki told Nagisa gently. "You concentrate on growing a few coin taller and we'll talk." "Isn't your older brother around?" Hayuri asked, stooping so that she was at eye level with the 2-year-old. "Why don't you go play with him?" "Hiro and I-san gone," Nagisa pouted. "Oh? Where did he go?" Hayuri asked, looking at Misaki. "Hiro-kun is at the elementary school dojo," Misaki said, jouncing Izumo on her knees. "That's right," Hayuri said. "He likes to watch the older boys train, doesn't he?" "He's actually training with them now," Misaki said, started as soon as he was big enough to lift the practice sword. "Isn't he only 5?" Hayuri said in astonishment. "I thought that was against policy." "The instructors made an exception," Misaki said. No 5-year-old had ever been admitted to the elementary school's beginner sword class, but Misaki's second son, Hiroshi, was not like other 5-year-olds. "He's a serious little boy, isn't he?" Setsuko said. "Like a miniature version of his father." "It's a little scary." "How come you can't be more like that, Ryokuen?" Hayuri prodded her own son, Ryota. She said it in a joking voice, but there was a distinct undercurrent of seriousness. "Well, he's still very young," Misaki said. "Ryota-kun, how old are you?" 4, Ryota said proudly. "There, you see," Misaki said. "You may be a little swordsman like Hiroshi by next year. Who knows? I am a swordman," Ryota announced, brandishing his toy katana. "I'm the best swordman in the world." "Is that so?" Misaki couldn't help but tease. "I challenge you to a duel," Ryota shouted, seemingly to no one in particular, probably quoting a cartoon he had seen. "I challenge you to a duel." On a whim, Misaki pulled her Jia, pulled the surrounding water molecules to her hand and froze them into a makeshift sword, well, more of a blunt icicle than a sword, the perfect size for combat with a 4-year-old. "I accept," she announced. "Misaki-san, what are you doing?" Hayuri asked. "Fight me, Yukino Ryota," Misaki intoned in her best cartoon villain voice, shifting Izumo over to her left hip where he was out of danger. "Ryokuen, don't," Hayuri warned. "Misaki-san is a lady." "It's not," but the boy, overcome with joy at having a playmate, was already wailing away at Misaki with his wooden sword. Misaki's arm moved on an almost forgotten impulse. In 2 moves, she had disarmed little Ryota. With another flick of her play sword, she had swept the boy off his feet. He landed on his back with a hard oof, and Misaki pointed the icicle down at his chest. "I am victorious," she said dramatically. "Admit defeat or I shall tickle you." "Oh no!" Ryota shrieked and scrambled away, giggling. "No, no." And Misaki couldn't help it. She hiked up her kimono and ran after him. The quick little boy probably hadn't expected a refined housewife like Misaki to catch up to him in 3 strides. He screamed when she scooped him up around the middle with one arm and laughed as she took him to the floor with tickles. "Misaki-san, what are you doing?" Hayuri cried, seemingly unsure whether to be scandalized or amused. "Don't worry, Hayuri-chan," Setsuko said. "This is something Misaki does every once in a while when she's in a happy mood." What Setsuko didn't understand was that this unfamiliar creature, this fearless, ridiculous woman who ran fast and played with swords, was an echo from a time when Misaki's whole life had been happy. Having recovered from the tickle attack, a giggling Ryota picked up his sword and came at Misaki again. This time, she gave some ground, letting the boy pick up on her rhythm and get a few good swings in before she disarmed him again. "I'm afraid Ryokuen is a ways away from being like Hirokuen," Hayuri laughed, "if he loses to a woman." Misaki could have mentioned that losing a fight against her was nothing for a young boy, or even a man, to be ashamed of, but that was a part of herself she didn't talk about anymore. Takuro had forbidden it. Me too. Nagase squealed, getting his own play sword and bouncing up and down. Ka-chan, me too. Boys, careful of the baby. Hairi warned as Ryota and Nagase charged Misaki at the same time. But Misaki was more than capable of fending off two children with her right arm while keeping her infant cradled comfortably in her left. It was only when the noise became too much for Izumo that he started crying and Misaki had to call off the duel. Sorry, boys, she said, turning her icicle sword to vapor with a wave of her hand. That's all for today. I yield. Good fight, Yukino Dano. She ruffled Ryota's hair. Matsuda Dano. She chucked Nagase under the chin. We'll have to duel again sometime. Smiling, she retreated to the couch to comfort Izumo. Oh no! Nagase dropped his play sword and followed his mother to the couch with a look of genuine worry. Baby crying. He's not upset with you, Nagakuen, Misaki assured the 2-year-old. He's just hungry. Tugging the front of her kimono open, Misaki maneuvered the bawling infant inside and gave him her breast. The squalling stopped almost immediately. You can't be too scared of a little carnage, Setsuko teased, prodding Izumo's foot. After all, you've got to grow up to be a great warrior, just like your grumpy father. Hey now, Setsuko, Misaki said with a smile. Don't make fun of my grumpy husband. He works hard to keep that frown plastered on his face all day. Mataku. Hairi exclaimed with an annoyed tsk of her tongue. Do you know how happy Dai would be if I could give him 4 good sons? I tell you, he would smile all day if he had a son like your Mamoru. If it's any consolation, I think Mamoru would be just as happy to have Dai-san as his father, Misaki said. Oh yeah? Hairi perked up. You didn't know? Dai-san is his favorite instructor he's ever had, for sword and Jia. That sent Hairi into a fit of giggles. Misaki-san, don't tease. I'm not teasing, Misaki said honestly. His father is Matsuda Takuru, Hairi said, master of the Whispering Blade, the greatest swordsman on the mountain. And a terrible teacher, Misaki said. The extent of his instruction is to cross his arms and glower and say, bad. Do it again. She pulled her face into a scowl and plunged to the lower limit of her vocal register to affect her husband's clipped monotone. Still bad. Do it again. Listen. Get it right or I'll gut you, you disgrace. What do you mean you don't understand? What's to understand? Just do it right. Stop. Stop. Setsuko begged, clutching her stomach with laughter. Your Takuro impression is too good. I'm going to die. How do you even get your voice that low? Hairi laughed. What? You mean like this? Misaki thundered. Silly woman, you couldn't possibly understand such matters. My manliness does not allow for human inflection. The trio plunged into another fit of giggles, and, because their mothers were laughing, Ryota and Nagase ended up laughing too. Misaki had spent years trying to belong with these people. They weren't like her friends from her school days. They weren't scrappy visionaries like Aline, or geniuses like Coley, or unstoppable forces of energy like Robin. They would never change the world, nor understand why someone would want to, but they loved her. She could laugh with them, and that was enough. There were days Misaki could convince herself that it was enough. Chapter 2: The Mist. The training arena was a broad shelf of rock that the monks used to use for exercise and meditation. According to legend, the flattened half-moon had been hewn out of the mountainside by the whispering blades of Matsuda's long-dead Mamoru's ancestors. Perfect weather for today's practice. Yukino-sensei bellowed over the wind whipping across the arena. Now we'll have a true test of accuracy. Mamoru heard teeth chattering and turned to see Quang with his arms pulled all the way into his uniform. Is it always so cold up here? The new boy shivered. Mamoru almost laughed. Wait until the winter. Human-sized bundles of straw stood at intervals across the arena, frozen to the rock by Yukino-sensei's ice. Tied to each bundle was a coarse cloth sign with a number painted on it. Mamoru's Jia was already itching to surge into action as Yukino-sensei raised his voice above the wind to explain the day's exercise. For most of this week, we've been working on forming aerodynamic ice projectiles. Now, you boys still have a great deal of work to do on that front, Yukino-sensei said, stopping in front of Mamoru to give him a pointed look, especially those of you who hope to one day master a certain bloodline technique. Mamoru gave his teacher a small, determined nod, and Yukino-sensei turned to address the entire class. Despite your subpar forming work, I'm going to cut you all some slack so that we can train the next technique. Today, I've made your projectiles for you. He gestured to a stack of perfectly formed ice spears, each one 3 strides long, with a fine point at one end and a broad base at the other to allow for a strong launch. What bloodline technique is he talking about? Kwang asked Mamoru as Yukino-sensei paced further down the line of boys. What does your family do that's so special? You're joking, right? Itsuki interjected with an incredulous look at Kwang. Mamoru is a Matsuda. No understanding registered on Kwang's face. Yes, the Matsudas are the masters of the Whispering Blade, Itsuki said. You must have heard of the Whispering Blade in the capital. Well, sure, but it's just a myth, Kwang laughed, but when the serious look on Itsuki's face didn't change, his smile faded and he turned to Mamoru with wide eyes. Isn't it? Mamoru shrugged. Some myths are true. But it's not possible, Kwang protested. No Jajaka can make ice strong enough to cut through steel. Some can. Are you one of them? Kwang asked in awe. Mamoru set his jaw. I will be. Kwang considered Mamoru, his eyes squinted in thought. I don't believe you, he said after a moment. Even Kusanagi Jajakalu can't be that powerful. Instead of retorting, Mamoru just nodded toward Yukino-sensei and said, Watch. The master Jajaka had lifted one of the spears from the pile with a gentle gesture of his hand. His 2 fingers were enough to keep the projectile hovering perfectly still in the air before him as he spoke. The strongest Jajaka can throw a spear 16 bounds, Yukino-sensei bellowed, pointing with his free hand across the arena to the straw dummy painted with the Kaigenese numeral 16. The best Fanyaka can use wind to launch a solid projectile 25 bounds. He pointed beyond the first dummy to one farther away labeled with a number 25. As a Jajaka, you can do much more. Placing a hand against the flattened end of the projectile, Yukino-sensei planted his feet and launched the ice forward. Mamoru had seen lightning Dai's Jia in action enough times that it no longer set his heart leaping into his throat. But beside him, he heard Kwang gasp. The spear blasted through the 16-bound dummy, through the 25-bound dummy, all the way to the end of the arena where it stuck into a third dummy marked with a barely discernible number 40. Holy Falik! Kwang breathed, gawking at the destroyed 16-bound bundle. Tajakalu may be able to use their physical strength to throw a projectile, Yukino-sensei said. Turning back to his class, Fanyakala may be able to use their Nyama to push against one. Our Nyama is the projectile. When a weapon is made of ice, we can control it down to the molecule. As Jajakalu, we are the only race of Theonite who can fight with a solid weapon that is truly an extension of the self. Yukino-sensei gave each student a stack of projectiles and had them line up across the arena to practice firing at the army of straw targets. Using his Jia to lift a spear, Mamoru laid his palm against the flat end and let his power rise. The ocean may not have been visible from Kimono Academy, but when Mamoru's pulled his Jia in his core, it seemed to reach all the way down the mountain, to the waves that crashed at its base and deeper than that, into the crushing depths where Mount Takayubi's roots met the seafloor. Ryuhan tradition claimed that the great families of Kusanagi were descended from the ocean gods who had dwelt in the Sea of Kaigen at the dawn of time. Most people of the peninsula regarded this part of their tradition as more metaphor than fact. Logically, there was no way human beings could be the direct descendants of titanic fish and sea dragons. But like many Matsudas before him, Mamoru experienced surges of madness when the feeling of his Jia consumed him. In those moments, he knew that the power rolling through his body was born from the ancient forces that had raised Kaigen from the sea. It was more than faith. It was fact. The power of gods rose, thunderous, like a wave inside Mamoru, and he rode the swell, moving his body with it. As the wave hit its apex, he sent its full force down his arm, through his open palm, into the ice. The projectile exploded through the air, shooting farther than anyone else's, but it didn't fly straight. It glanced off the stone shelf, breaking its fletching blades, and skidded to a stop off to the side of the 25-pound target. Mamoru frowned and shook out his hands. He was just getting warmed up. With his full power, he would launch the spear so hard that it would have no choice but to go straight through the target. Letting a new wave of Nyama build in his body, Mamoru launched again. This spear managed to clip the 25-pound target, but it wasn't a clean hit, and the ice broke apart instead of penetrating. "Stop pushing so hard, Matsuda-san," Yukino-sensei said patiently. "You have more than enough power to send a projectile clear across this arena. Relax your shoulders and focus on accuracy over force." "Yes, sensei," Mamoru breathed and raised another projectile. "Slow down." Yukino-sensei reached out and placed his fingertips on the ice, stilling it before Mamoru could raise it level with the target. "Your Jia is too excited. I can feel it roaring every which way inside you. Take a moment to calm it. Focus your energy, then try again." Mamoru nodded and Yukino-sensei moved down the line to observe the other boys, giving them each a few well-placed pieces of advice. Mamoru's mother had once said that Yukino-dai dealt his words as carefully as he dealt his cuts. It was what made him such a good teacher. "Don't over-rotate," Yukino-sensei scolded his younger cousin, Yuta, giving the boy a hard rap on the head with his knuckles. "If you swing through without calculating your point of release, you'll crash your projectile short of its target every time." "Yes, sensei." Yuta rubbed his head and tried again, this time managing to send his spear neatly into the 16-pound target. Satisfied, Yukino-sensei turned his attention from Yuta to Kwang, just as the northern newcomer sent his third spear spinning off course to crash to pieces on the rock shelf. Yukino-sensei frowned at the new student, and Kwang cringed, clearly expecting to be mocked or smacked on the head. But all Yukino-sensei said was, "I bet you're very good at the spear throw." "Yes," Kwang said in surprise. "How did you stop trying to throw with your shoulder? Project from the hip, straight out through your palm, like you're punching a man in the solar plexus." "Sensei," Itsuki complained from further down the line, "the wind keeps pushing mine off course." "These projectiles are made to cut through the wind, Mizumaki-san." "Again. I want to see." He paused to watch Itsuki attempt a launch, sending the spear wide. "Your launch is weak." Yukino-sensei put his hands on Itsuki's shoulders and maneuvered him back into his starting position. "Angle your stance this way. Bend your knees. A little deeper. There." Having given his Jia time to settle, Mamoru returned his attention to his own task. As usual, Yukino-sensei was right. Mamoru's aim got much better after he relaxed, but even with his projectiles flying straight, he still couldn't seem to get one past the 25-pound target. "What are you scowling about?" Kwang asked him at one point. "You're shooting way better than everyone else." Not as well as Yukino-sensei, Mamoru thought, but he couldn't say that aloud, so he just clenched his jaw and raised another spear from his stack. Mamoru was almost full-grown now, and better than everyone else wasn't good enough. A Matsuda had to be as good as 100 other Jijakula put together. He had to be the best anyone had ever seen. In his frustration, Mamoru threw his whole body into the movement, slamming the next spear toward its target. The projectile hit the 25-pound target and went through it. "Falik!" Kwang exclaimed as Mamoru's projectile slid to a stop several strides beyond the target. "What was that?" Not bothering to respond, Mamoru lifted another projectile from the stack. Using his Jia to keep it hovering at chest height, he backed up a few paces and ran at it. He didn't even put the whole force of his Jia into the launch, but the projectile still managed to penetrate the 25-pound target and burst out the other side. "What did you just do?" Kwang asked in astonishment. "Why are we planting?" Mamoru said, looking from the penetrated target to his own feet. "What? Why are we planting our feet and launching when we could add the power of momentum?" Come again?" "The strongest waves start far out at sea." "Mamoru-kun," Yuta warned, recognizing the look on his friend's face. "You know what Sensei says about your ideas, I know," Mamoru cut him off, raising another projectile. "Just give me a Dinma." He had to try it. He had to. Locking his Jia into the ice, he threw the projectile high into the air and released. As the projectile started to fall, Mamoru backed up as far as the shelf allowed. He would have to hit the spear on its way down. It would require perfect timing, but timing came naturally to Mamoru. He gave the spear one last moment to descend and then sprinted at it. On his last step, he launched himself into the air and spun. His forward momentum combined with the power of the spin and the gravity pulling him earthward. As his body whipped around, he drove his palm into the base of the projectile and launched. The force of a tsunami exploded through his palm. All anyone saw was a flash of silver before the projectile slammed into the 40-pound target in a spray of straw. Mamoru hit the stone in a crouch and let out his breath. He had done it. The mountainside rang with the shocked cries of his classmates, then with cheers as they took in the destroyed 40-pound target. However, when Mamoru's eyes found Yukino-sensei, the sword master was not smiling. "Matsuda," he roared over the wind, and the class fell silent. "What in the Duna do you think you are doing?" "Sorry, sensei." Mamoru tried to look apologetic, but he couldn't quite wipe the smile off his face. "Get your ego under control. You will do the drill as I instruct, or you will leave my class. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." When the rest of the class finished their excited murmurings and returned to the drill, Mamoru felt Yukino-sensei's fingers dig into his ear, pulling his head back. Stifling an ouch, he let his teacher drag him from the line. "Sensei," he started when they were out of earshot of the rest of the class. Mamoru-kun," Yukino-sensei cut him off in a low voice. "There is a reason we begin this drill with both feet on the ground." "I'm sorry." Don't interrupt," the sword master said mildly. "I want you to consider for a moment that if I had the rest of these boys flying and spinning during this exercise, I would have a lot of dead boys. Do you understand?" "Yes, sensei," Mamoru said with a biting pang of guilt. He hadn't thought of that. He had been too focused on himself. "Matsudas are more than flashy fighters," Yukino-sensei said. "They are leaders, and a leader must think of those around him." "Yes, sensei." "Good." Yukino-sensei released Mamoru's aching ear and raised his hand. Mamoru flinched, expecting to feel the crack of his teacher's knuckles, but the sword master just put his hand atop his head. "Now," he said, "if you are going to launch from a spin, make sure the knee that you lead with stays tucked close to your body through the entire rotation. You lose momentum when you let your legs stick out. Once you have a tightly controlled rotation, try stomping backward with your right leg at the moment of the launch. Learn to put all of that together, and you'll be firing spears further than mine in no time." In his surprise, Mamoru could only say, "Oh. Practice at home, yes?" "Yes, sensei." When the wind on the shelf reached dangerous speeds and the students started running low on projectiles, Yukino-sensei moved his class indoors for sword practice. The 3 hours of sparring wore most of the boys to exhaustion. To Mamoru, they felt more like a warm-up, but he kept Yukino-sensei's words in mind. He kept the other boys in mind. He had been guilty of leaving horrible bruises on classmates who were too slow to block his wooden blade, which was all of them, but he was more careful today, focusing mainly on feinting, blocking, and evading. Mamoru found a new level of focus trying to outmaneuver his classmates without actually hitting them. His heart sank when the bell tolled, signaling the end of training. Knees shook and sweat dripped onto the tatami as the boys packed up their gear and headed to history class. To Kwang's credit, he had not passed out, as new students often did in Yukino-sensei's sword class, though he didn't seem to be able to walk without the support of the wall. "Come on, city boy," Yuta teased, taking Kwang's arm as they left the dojo. "You can lean on me." Mamoru, Yukino-sensei stopped him before he could follow his classmates out of the room. "Excellent work today. I'm glad to see that your control is developing along with your ridiculous speed." Mamoru nodded. From the swordsman once known as Lightning Dai, that was high praise. "I haven't gotten the chance to speak with your father or uncle in some time," Yukino-sensei said, returning the extra bakken to the closet. "Have either of them been working on the Whispering Blade with you?" "Aye." Mamoru felt his smile fade. "My father's been trying to." "Good," Yukino-sensei said earnestly. The pride in his eyes made Mamoru want to shrink in shame. There was very little that did not come easily to Mamoru, but his father had been trying to teach him the Whispering Blade for almost a year now, and he hadn't come anywhere near mastering it. For centuries, the Matsuda family had passed down the secret to forming weapons of impervious ice. The technique was so difficult that no non-Matsuda had ever figured it out, and Mamoru was starting to wonder how anyone had ever figured it out. It wasn't enough to be an excellent sword fighter. It wasn't enough to be good at summoning and shaping ice. The Whispering Blade came from something deeper that Mamoru just didn't understand. His father understood it, but Matsuda Takuro did not have Yukino-sensei's magical ability to put his skill into words. No matter how he explained, Mamoru just couldn't understand. "I'm not doing well," he blurted out before thinking better of it. "My father is frustrated with me." Mamoru regretted the words as soon as they were out of his mouth. It was beyond inappropriate for a student to discuss his problems at home with his teacher, and it was forbidden for a Matsuda to discuss the details of the Whispering Blade with anyone outside the family. "I wish I could help you," the swordmaster said after a moment, "but I'm a Yukino and I'm not your father. Even if it were my place to speak to you about this, I wouldn't be much help. I don't know what the Whispering Blade entails." "I know, Sensei," Mamoru said, looking at his feet. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but I do know a great Jujaka when I see one," Yukino-sensei said. "I know that you have the same force of Nyama in you as your father and other great fighters of your line." Mamoru nodded. But Matsuda power wasn't necessarily enough. A Matsuda's ultimate purpose was to turn himself into a weapon strong enough to defend his empire from anything. This was what Mamoru and every man of his line had been born for. Despite this, there were many Matsudas who tried their whole lives and never produced a Whispering Blade. Since he was old enough to picture the future, Mamoru had cultivated this image of the perfect man, the perfect warrior, Whispering Blade in hand. He was nearing fighting age, but that man still seemed so far away. What if it's not enough? What if? A Matsuda was supposed to be above fear, yet here Mamoru was, too scared to finish the sentence. What if I'm not enough? "Mamoru-kun," Yukino-sensei's voice softened. "Your father was 16 when he mastered the Whispering Blade, your uncle 1 year older, and they were among the youngest masters in history. You have time. I promise, you will be fine." "You can't promise that." In his anxiety, Mamoru didn't seem to be able to control the stupid things coming out of his mouth. There have been other Matsudas with powerful Jia who never mastered it. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know you, Mamoru-kun," Yukino-sensei said, "beyond your lineage and your raw power. In the space of time it takes a normal boy to grasp a technique, you've already improved it and expanded it to all its potential applications and then some. It's rather annoying as your teacher. Sorry about that, but I have no doubt that it is precisely that kind of ingenuity that gave rise to the Whispering Blade in the first place. A student like you, who can absorb what he is told but also think beyond it, is capable of anything." Mamoru's mouth opened, but he was so stunned, so touched, that he couldn't find any words to thank his teacher. "How did you thank someone for praise you hadn't earned?" "Now, get to class," Yukino-sensei said, nodding toward the door. "Yes, sensei." Ducking his head, Mamoru gathered his things and hurried to follow his classmates. After the heart-pumping rush of sword practice, history class was always agony. When the wind was high, the school creaked like an old ship, and Hibiki-sensei's voice had a way of getting lost in the dull moaning of the wooden beams. There were a number of factors that led to the Great War, or what the Yamankulu call the Kaliba. Kalubiye. Hibiki-sensei wrote the Yaman ink letters out on the board, and Mamoru sank his teeth into the knuckles of his left fist, hoping the pain might keep him awake. First, there was the tension between the colonial powers, Yama and Sizui, which were in constant competition with each other for the resources of Bacteria. Next, there was the tension created by the Bacterian colonies rejecting Yamanka and Sizuian rule. Last, of course, there was the tension between our own great empire and the extremist rebels in the West who would one day betray their emperor to establish the Ranganese Union. "Are you not going to take notes?" Mamoru whispered to Kwang, noticing that the new boy had not even picked up his brush pen. "Oh, I don't have to. I'm used to learning the Yamenka way with my ears. Besides, he murmured even more quietly, I've heard all this crap before anyway. What? Mamoru leaned in, unsure he had heard right. Had Kwang just called Hibiki-sensei's history lesson crap? Matsuda-san, Hibiki-sensei said sharply, no talking in class. Sorry, sensei, Mamoru said as the teacher returned to his lecture. Now, there are several background dates you will need to know in regard to the Kaliba. The first one is 5153. He wrote the date on the board. This is the year of the First Iberian Rebellion, when a group of violent extremists calling themselves the Longhouse Confederacy developed enough of a following to mount armed resistance against the Yamenka Empire. Iberia, despite being plagued by intertribal violence and not having a stable government of its own, wanted independence from Yama. Of course, these disorganized rebels were quickly subdued by Yama's superior forces. Behind him, Mamoru thought he heard Kwang make a critical, sound, but when he turned to look over his shoulder, the northern boy was listening quietly. With their inferior genes, the Iberians' defeat was inevitable. The Yamenkalu are pure-blooded Tajakalu, born and bred to wield the power they possess, whereas the Iberians who opposed them were of mixed blood, the product of intermarriage between the Iberian natives, Yamenkalu, Kaigenese immigrants, and most damaging of all, white slaves. This kind of impurity dilutes the divine energies that give Theonites their power. Mixed Theonites, such as the Iberians, could never hope to stand unaided against a pure-blooded Tajaka army. Now, I want to give you several dates relating to the Yamenka-Sizwean competition over their colonial territories. Mamoru tried to take notes as Hibiki-sensei droned on in Kaijengwa and found himself doodling instead. He started out drawing the straight blade of a sword, but a gust of wind pushed against the school, his brush bend slid, and the sword became water. Mamoru followed the new curve and added lines beneath it, turning it into a rough approximation of the Tsusano wave, his mother's family crest. More waves fell in beside the Tsusano crest, some turned to fish, and Mamoru had filled half the page with stormy sea before he remembered that he was supposed to be paying attention to the lecture. This brings us to the dates leading up to the Kaliba itself, Hibiki-sensei said, and Mamoru tried to refocus on the lecture. 5286, the year that the Carithian Union formed and resisted Yamenka rule. Hibiki-sensei wrote the year up on the board. 5287, he wrote the next date as Mamoru scrambled to catch up with his notes. In this year, the Sizwean colony of Malusia staged a major uprising that shook Sizwe's control of the entire region. At the same time, there was a rash of peasant uprisings in the western part of the Kaigenese Empire. These were quickly put down by our own imperial army, but they foreshadowed bigger rebellions to come. 5288. Under the influence of corrupt politicians, a collection of cities, led by Ranga, rose against the Kaigenese Empire. This rebellion was put down the same year, and its leaders publicly executed for their treason against the empire. 5289, the year that Yama defeated Sizwe for control of Malusia and pressed to take Sizwe's other colonies, escalating the long-standing tensions between the two Kalendugika superpowers. 5290, Kaigen's western provinces rose up in rebellion once again. Using propaganda and false promises, the Thulanist rebels managed to trick the uneducated peasants of Ranga into following them in greater numbers than ever before. At the same time, the Longhouse Confederacy of Iberia staged a reprisal of its bid for independence in 5153 under the same flag. At the tail end of that year, on the 28th of Krabakalo, Ranganese terrorists attacked a graduation ceremony at Daybreak Academy in Karitha, killing Principal Oyed Baida, along with several Yamenka and Kaigenese students. It was following this malicious and cowardly attack that Yama agreed to support our great empire in its fight against the Ranganese rebels. 5291. Early in this year, the Yamenkalu allied with us, bringing foreign troops onto Kaigenese soil for the first time. In response to their involvement, Sizwe aligned itself both with our own rebel enemies and with the Iberian rebels fighting against Yama for their independence. This led to open war between Yama and Sizwe. Abtia aligned with Yama. 5292. This year marked the only time in Duna's history that all the major Theonite powers Kaigen, Yama, Abdia, and Sizui were at war. It was in this year that the Ranganese Fanyakalo launched their attack on Shirajima and were soundly defeated. In the end, victory in war always comes down to bloodlines, Hibiki-sensei said, turning to face his class with a dramatic flourish. We here on the Sword of Kaigen are blessed to have some of the best and purest Jujaka bloodlines in the world. Matsuda, he said, pointing at Mamoru, Yukino, he indicated Yuta, and then went on to point to the other great houses represented in the classroom, Amino, Ginkawa, Aikino, Katakuri. All of you belong to a chain of great fighters stretching back to mythic times. Since the dawn of Kaigen, this peninsula has held its enemies back without fail. This is why we are called the Sword of Kaigen. And again, during the Kaliba, the Matsudas, the Yukinos, and the other powerful Jujakalu of the Kusanagi Peninsula beat back their enemies in resounding victory. This time Mamoru was sure he heard a disdainful huff behind him, but he kept his attention on the lecture as Hibiki-sensei continued, for this is the Sword of Kaigen. To charge it is to die. When the Ranganese armada reached the Kusanagi Peninsula, the warriors of the Matsuda, Yukino, Amino, Aikino, and Ginkawa houses, along with all their vassal fighters, formed a line along the beach. At the first news of Ranganese ships, our capital sent a request to Yama for aid. But by the time the Yamenka forces reached our peninsula, the Jujaka soldiers here, your own grandfathers and great-grandfathers, had already laid waste to the Ranganese invaders. Yamenka pilots tell of flying the length of the peninsula to find the beaches awash in red, like the edge of the blade that has tasted victory. Prepared for battle, the men of Yama flew lower, only to discover that the battle was done. The bodies in the sea wore Ranganese uniforms. The red staining the sand was the impure blood of Fanyakalu, for the warriors of Kusanagi had fought with such fury that there were hardly any Kaigenese casualties. Mamoru heard Kwang let out an unmistakable huff of laughter. Hibiki-sensei heard it too. Is our history funny to you, Kwang-san? No, sensei. I'm sorry. Hibiki-sensei gave Kwang a last cold look before turning back to the class to continue, this time in dialect. This is your past. This is your heritage. You are here at this school because you are the descendants of the greatest fighters Duna has ever seen. The best blood in the world flows through your veins. If you learn well, listen well, and work hard, the Sword of Kaigen will survive, bright and sharp, to be passed down to your sons, and their sons after them. Misaki. In her first year at Theonite Academy, Misaki had earned top grades in all her courses. In her second year, she achieved one of the fastest times on the agility course, second only to Robin Thundiel's. In her third year, she had bested some of Caritha's most feared machete fighters in single combat. As a teenager, she had worn those accomplishments with pride, never realizing that at 34, her proudest accomplishment would be getting 5 rambunctious children to nap at the same time. Success, she whispered when she arrived back home, arms full of dozing 5-year-old. Success, Hayuri confirmed as Misaki used her toes to slide the shoes off her feet. They're all asleep, just like you planned. Hiroshi had nodded off on Misaki's shoulder as she carried him back from the elementary school. Fresh off of 2 hours of sword practice with children twice his size, even he ran out of steam. His hair was damp with sweat and his little hands were blistered from gripping the oversized practice sword, but he hadn't uttered a word of complaint, just quietly collapsed against his mother and let her carry him the rest of the way home. He was a strange creature, her second son. She had known when he was nothing more than a small heartbeat inside her that he was his father's child. Cold. It was said that all Jujakalu were born with something of the sea in them, but most seas had their warm currents and their cold, volcanic springs in the depths, free water between ice flows. Even the iciest Jujakalu had some warm places in their soul. At least that was what Misaki had thought before she married into the Matsuda family. Hiroshi was born with the deadly calm of a sea-frozen solid. Like his father, he was cold to the touch no matter his mood or level of exertion. Even his sweat was cool, like morning dew. He murmured something about footwork as Misaki lay him on the futon where Ryota and Nagisa were already fast asleep. Misaki breathed into his hair. We're almost 5 for 5. What? Hiroshi's eyes blinked open. Nothing. Misaki put a hand on his forehead, easing him down beside his brother. Nothing, my little warrior. Just rest. Hiroshi nodded and slipped off to sleep. And we did it. Misaki whispered, sliding the door shut behind her. All 5 of them are down. How long do you think it'll last? Hayari asked. Probably not that long, Misaki sighed, sinking down on the cushions beside the other 2 women. The boys are all properly exhausted, but the babies will wake up hungry before long. Misaki wanted desperately to close her eyes and drop off to sleep herself, but she knew she should make use of her hands while they weren't full of squirming infant, so she hauled herself up and got out her sewing box. The family crest had begun to tear from the back of Takeru's haori and needed to be restitched. Carefully, she picked out the right thread to match the dark blue and white diamonds of the Matsuda crest and threaded her needle. At the height of the Matsuda family's power, during Kaigen's Wars of Succession all the way through the Kaliba, the ancient compound had been full of servants who did all the cooking, cleaning, and sewing for the lady of the house. Takeru's father had complained bitterly about the damn vassal houses not sending servants anymore, but Misaki could hardly fault Purur Kuronu for deserting a house that could no longer support them. Warrior houses like the Matsudas once made their living training sons of lesser houses in Jia and swordsmanship. Students came in droves in times of unrest, when battles were common, but peacetime was a different story. In the decades since the Kaliba, even the promise of the chance to train with the greatest swordsman in Kaigen hadn't been enough to keep most of the common Kuronu in Takayubi. Still, the Matsuda crest was a mark of pride, and Misaki made sure it was stitched into every coat, kimono, and haori they owned. I should probably get some work done too, Hayari said, pulling her own sewing project out of the bag she had brought from home. As tired as Misaki had grown of stitching the same 4 diamonds into a dozen articles of clothing, she didn't envy Hayari her sewing tasks. The Yukino insignia was a snowflake. It's so quiet, Setsuko mused. I can't remember the last time the compound was this peaceful. You might be a genius, little sister. Well, I try. Misaki smiled. And to think, my poor mother raised 9 of us in a house the size of this room. Setsuko said. No wonder she's gotten loopy after all these years. Oh, how's your mother, Setsuko? Misaki asked, turning to her sister-in-law. You went to visit her a few weeks back, didn't you? Misaki had been so busy juggling the new baby and the 2 older boys that she hadn't gotten a moment of quiet to ask how the trip had gone. My mother is fine, Setsuko said, still in bizarrely good health, but she is getting old. Like I said, her mind is going a bit. She's convinced the Ranganese are going to come across the ocean to attack us. Why does she think that? Hayari was laughing, but Misaki stilled, her grip tightening on her needle. She says she can feel it, Setsuko said, an old fisherwoman's intuition or something like that. She says Fanyaka wind tastes different from the normal sea air. That's a strange thing to say, Hayari said. Well, Setsuko's mother has lived on the ocean for 90 years, Misaki pointed out. She was here the last time the Ranganese came. Maybe she knows something we don't. You think my kooky mother is onto something? Setsuko said in amusement. If the Ranganese were to attack, this area would be the first to feel it, Misaki said, and the first hit. The Kusanagi Peninsula extended far out into the Kaigenese Sea, barring the way to the archipelago's safe ports and beaches. Any invader from the sea had to first get past the mountainous spit of land and its inhabitants. But we don't have anything to fear from Ranga, Hayari said dismissively. Our brothers and husbands are powerful enough to turn away any invaders. And anyway, if there was a serious threat from the Ranganese, the government would have told us. Maybe, Misaki said, doubtful. What do you mean, maybe? I mean, Misaki paused. I just mean that the news isn't necessarily true. What? Hayari looked positively stricken and Misaki wished she hadn't said anything. Misaki-chan says some weird, ominous things sometimes, Setsuko said with a reproachful look at her sister-in-law. Don't worry your pretty head about it. But Hayari was still staring at Misaki, uncomprehending. Are you saying our government would lie to us? The answer was yes, of course, but Misaki couldn't say that straight. That just wasn't the sort of thing you said in Kaigen. Misaki? Hayari prompted, and there was so much fear and hurt in those pretty eyes that Misaki had to offer some response. She bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. I went to school with a lot of Yamenka Jaisliwo, she said finally, self-proclaimed keepers of Yama's history. The funny thing about these Jaisliwo is that, depending on their family, their native region of Yama, and the corona they served, they told vastly different histories. Sometimes two of them would sit right next to each other and tell conflicting accounts of the same event. I talked to one of these Jaisliwo. I asked him how he could say that his history was true when the next Jasali over told me a different story and claimed that that was the truth. In my mind, one of them had to be lying. I told him that. And what did he say? Setsuko asked. He said, there are a million ways to tell the same story. Our job as Jaisliwu is to find the one the listener needs to hear. Not necessarily the one that makes them the happiest or the one that gives them the most information, but the one they need to hear to do what they need to do. He told me that's how Jaisliwu care for Koronu and other Kafakalu. All right, Hayari said, clearly confused. What does that have to do with our government? Well, I think that's the way the Kaigenese government takes care of us, Misaki said, the same way a Jasali in Yama takes care of his Koro. Of course, in Yama, Jaisliwu were free to decide the way they sang their songs and told their histories. They weren't issued government-approved scripts to recite, but that wasn't a discussion Hayari would appreciate. Our emperor tells us the things we need to hear. From the way Hayari was blinking at her, Misaki could tell she didn't understand. So, do you think our government is right about how safe we are? Setsuko asked. Or, do you think my dear old mother is onto something? Well, it's been a long time since I've been out of the country, Misaki admitted, but I know that the Fanyukala can do more than most Kaigenese believe. Really? Hayari didn't look convinced. Like what? Well, back when the Ranganese first split from the empire, warfare was different, Misaki said. The Kaigenese Empire's military had always been based on Jijakalu like us, with Fanyukalu as an afterthought. That's only natural, Hayari said. Fanyukalu are just untrained peasants. Jijakalu are purer, more powerful. Well, not really, Misaki said. Not always. What are you talking about? Hayari asked with a note of annoyance. If Fanyukalu are truly as good as we are, why would our empire ever keep a military of all Jijakalu? Because the empire's main centers of power, Yongsan, Shirajima, Haijing, have always been peopled mainly by Jijakalu, Misaki said, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The success of the Ranganese Revolution proved that a big force of Fanyukalu, even a disorganized one, could defeat a Jijaka army. But they didn't defeat us, Hayari said indignantly. The revolution wasn't a success. Well, Setsuko said, they did split the empire in half. But they didn't truly best our armies, Hayari insisted. As soon as they reached the ocean, we drove them back inland. Right. Misaki forgot that that was what you learned if you went to high school in Kaigen, but she didn't need to argue that with Hayari right now. You're right, but that's part of my point. During the Kaliba, the Ranganese military was not well organized or well trained. Fanyukala had never worked together in those numbers, so they hadn't figured out specialized military formations to rival ours or Yama's, but the Ranganese Union has been a sovereign power for 78 years now. They've had decades to figure out how to function as a fighting force. Those groups of Fanyukala can do things no one would have dreamed of 50 years ago. How do you know all this? Hayari asked. Hush now, Hayari-chan, Setsuko said in a conspiratorial whisper. Takaru-sama doesn't like anyone mentioning this, but Misaki-chan actually lived outside Kaigen for a long time. No. Hayari's pretty eyes widened in shock. Oh yes, Setsuko said. When she was a teenager, she attended this fancy international Theonite school in Karida. Karida. Hayari's eyes got even bigger. So far away. Yes, Setsuko said, reveling in the younger woman's shock, and at that weird international school, Misaki made all kinds of weird international friends, including this roommate of hers, who was Setsuko paused for dramatic effect before whispering, "A Ranganese Funyaka." "No," Hayari exclaimed again, dropping her sewing to put both hands over her mouth. "Misaki-san, wasn't that scary?" "Not really," Misaki said, not looking up from her own work. "She was just a 13-year-old girl, and I think she was more scared of me than I was of her, at least until we got to know each other better." "But you couldn't really be friends, could you?" Hayari said anxiously. "I mean, she was Ranganese." Misaki shrugged. "We argued a lot during our first 2 years. Her table manners weren't my favorite." But she stopped before trying to elaborate any further. Trying to explain her school days to Hayari would probably do more harm than good. Misaki generally considered it a bad idea to talk about Daybreak to anyone but Setsuko, and even Setsuko couldn't really understand. There was only so much a person could understand, having lived her whole life on the same tiny island cluster. "And your Fanyaka roommate, she's the one who told you these things about the Ranganese military?" Hayari said. "Some of them, yes," Misaki said. Of course, she had also had other Ranganese friends, acquaintances, and professors, but Hayari didn't need to know that. "Well, then she probably made it up," Hayari said with the kind of innocent confidence that could only come from a life lived in the mists of nationalism. "Everyone knows Ranganese people can't be trusted." Misaki didn't respond. "And anyway," Hayari continued matter-of-factly, "it doesn't matter how strong the Ranganese Union has gotten because Kaigen is stronger now too. You can look at any news report to see that our military is bigger than ever and our economy is booming." Misaki didn't comment, focusing instead on her sewing. Personally, she suspected that Kaigen was not actually experiencing the economic paradise that the TV reporters claimed. If they were, the wealth certainly wasn't extending to Shirajima. Setsuko's fishing village had fallen on hard times, and the last time Misaki's parents had visited, they had told her that the two biggest factories near Ishihama had closed, leaving 1,000 people without jobs. Years ago, the Empire had promised a modern magdrak between Shirajima's major islands, but the project had never been finished. "It's laughable to think that Ranga poses any threat to us here," Hayari said. "Any warrior will tell you that Kaigen has the strongest fighters. Any warrior will tell you that even the strong can't afford complacency," Misaki murmured. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Misaki shook her head. "It's not important." As Setsuko offered Hayari laughing reassurances, Misaki stared at the blue cloth in her lap and wondered why she hadn't thought about this sooner. The Kaliba had cost Kaigen its most productive agricultural provinces, most of its underpaid workforce, and many of its major trade routes, resources that now belonged to the Ranganese Union. The Fanyukalu at Daybreak had been able to do things Misaki never would have dreamed of, and that had been a long time ago. What could Ranga's armies do with 15 more years of practice? Kaigen may have avoided total collapse the last time it went to war with Ranga, but would the Empire fare as well against a new attack? When Misaki stepped back to consider all the pieces, it stood to reason that Ranga was far stronger than it had been at the time of the Kaliba, and Kaigen was far weaker. But here, high in the obscuring mists of Takayubi, where nothing seemed to have changed for 1,000 years, it was easy to believe the fantasy of a stable world. Mamoru. As the class made their way to the schoolyard for lunch, Mamoru picked up his pace to catch up with Kwang. "What was that about?" he asked, falling into step beside the city boy. What about?" "Back there in history class." "Why were you laughing?" "I was trying not to," Kwang said, "and I wouldn't call the garbage that Jasali was regurgitating history." "What do you mean?" Itsuki demanded as he and Yuta caught up. "You realize that at least half the stuff he tells you isn't even true." Kwang looked around at the 3 Takayubi boys. "It's propaganda." "Propaganda?" Mamoru had only heard the word used a few times before. People said that propaganda was what the Ranganese Union used to trick its uneducated citizens into fighting its battles. It was a distinctly Ranganese tactic. Kaigen didn't use propaganda. Everyone knew that. Falik. Kwang swore. "You guys in this village really believe all this stuff, don't you? You believe everything the government tells you. Why wouldn't we?" Itsuki asked earnestly. "You must see what's happening here." Kwang's voice was almost imploring as he looked from one face to the next. The Emperor is using you. We're happy to serve our Emperor, Yuta chimed in passionately. How can he be using us? He can feed you lies about Ranga and about your own ancestors. He can make you think you're invincible when you're really not. We are the Sword of Kaigen, Yuta said fiercely, the defenders of the Empire. Kwang scoffed. That's a fancy way of saying cannon fodder. Mamoru's voice turned to ice. What did you just say? From the way Kwang went tense, it was obvious that he felt the simmering fury of Mamoru's Nyama. Mamoru watched the northern boy's eyes flick in indecision, and then experienced a grudging flutter of admiration when the city boy held his ground and looked him in the eye. I said you're cannon fodder. Kwang's voice was even. The Emperor will give you guys any made-up story if it means you'll stay put and die for him. You may think you're great warriors with some noble purpose, but as far as the capital is concerned, you're just game pieces. Mamoru stood, staring down at Kwang, his eyes narrowed. The ocean seethed in his fists. Take that back. I'm not taking anything back, Kwang said stubbornly. I'm going to lunch. He started to walk away, but Mamoru stepped in front of him, barring his way out of the courtyard. I said take it back. You think you scare me, Matsuda? Kwang's fingers curled and Mamoru felt the other boy's Jia ripple, ready for action. I don't care how good a fighter you are. If you take another step closer, Mamoru stepped forward. You'll what? Kwang moved fast. His ice-knuckled uppercut would have worked on just about any Theonite, but Mamoru was not just any Theonite. He sidestepped the punch and had the city boy on the ground in an instant. There was a satisfying thud as Kwang's back hit the courtyard stones, knocking the breath from his body. Still stunned, the northern boy tried to draw the surrounding water vapor to his hands for another attack, but Mamoru's Jia smashed through his, knocking the molecules from his control. He hauled Kwang up by the front of his uniform. Mist gathered to form a blade of ice along the back of his free hand, protruding from the knuckles to point at Kwang's throat. It was no steel-cleaving sasayeba, but it would pierce a human body. Whoa! Mamoru could barely hear Itsuki and Yuta's alarmed voices through the rising swell of his rage. Easy, Mamoru-kun. Take the edge off that blade before we get in trouble. You're a good fighter, Kwang said, somehow still smug with a blade at his throat, and your small-town pride is cute, but it's all based on a lie. Mamoru's teeth ground together and his eyes sharpened. Mamoru-kun, you don't want to kill him. You're right. Mamoru let out his breath, his blade turning to water. What he wanted to do was punch Kwang in his smug face. So he did. Right as the headmaster walked into the schoolyard.